Moses called a massacre, and then he lied about it. He said, God told me to do it. That's how the 10 Commandments were established. Harry Truman, after dropping 2 nukes on civilians, never lost a single night of sleep over it. Good people always make bad leaders. The worst thing you can be, for Machiavelli, is effeminate, lacking in this manly virtue. Machiavelli believed in the great man theory of history, that rare and marvelous men can rise up and completely change the course of events. Studying Machiavelli has thoroughly radicalized me. If even the great Moses lied and cheated to satisfy his political goals, who the hell are you to be so damn precious about your morality? Machiavelli wrote his books to teach the few and not the many. He wrote to teach those rare and marvelous men that come once every few hundred years how to achieve the grandest political projects, the founding of states, civilizations, and even religions. And Machiavelli's chief lesson for them is this: always being good makes you weak and effeminate, and you will lose to those who aren't. Good people, people who are altruistic, public-spirited, compassionate, make terrible leaders. As a leader, then, you must operate on a different set of rules than everyone else. It is good that you are selfish. It is good that you have a lust for glory. You must be willing to cheat, lie, murder, steal if necessary. But you must do all of this while appearing to be good, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is what you will learn in our lecture today: why and how to enter into evil. So in part 1 of this lecture, I'm going to try to ease you in to Machiavelli's ideas by helping you understand his leader par excellence, Moses. Almost more so than any other leader, Achilles, Caesar, certainly, Alexander. It is Moses that he holds up as the prime model of how to enter into evil. I know what you're thinking, right? How can that be? This is blasphemy. Moses is the greatest political leader in the Jewish tradition. He remains one of the greatest prophets in the Christian tradition. At Jesus' transfiguration, when his divinity is revealed, this is in Matthew, there's only 2 people next to him: Elijah and Moses, okay? When we think Moses, we think good, we think honest, humble, we think compassionate, generous. When we think Machiavelli, we think evil, deceptive, prideful, self-absorbed. So how can Moses possibly be Machiavelli's model of entering into evil if he is literally the lawgiver, right? He established the 10 Commandments. Machiavelli would respond, look more closely at how Moses established those 10 Commandments. Whoever reads the Bible judiciously will see that since he wished his laws and his orders to go forward, Moses was forced to kill infinite men who, moved by nothing other than envy, were opposed to his plans. Moses called a massacre, and then he lied about it. He said, God told me to do it. That's how the 10 Commandments were established. Now, let me be clear. Machiavelli highlights Moses' evil doing, not to expose him, not like many moderns who go around tearing down statues, denouncing great men for their problematic deeds, just the opposite. Machiavelli points out Moses' evil not to discredit him, but to empower you. If even the great, the saintly, the faultless Moses lied and cheated to satisfy his political goals, who the hell are you to be so damn precious about your morality? This is why Moses is the chief example of entering into evil, precisely because our conception of him is so good. And that's the story I will begin this lecture with in part 1 to help you ease you into his invitation into evil. Okay. Exodus 32. Israelites freed from Egypt, and they're all huddled around the base of Mount Sinai. God himself comes down, himself, not in persona form, but in thunder, lightning, fire, trumpets, and he speaks in his own voice to the Israelites, the 10 Commandments. First commandment, no gods before me, okay? No idolatry. People get scared. God is literally screaming to your face, and they say, Moses, you act as an intermediary, okay? You help us mediate this situation. Moses, goes up the mountain for 40 days, and he creates these 2 tablets, right, with the 10 commandments written upon them. The Israelites, they get a bit impatient. They're like, why hasn't Moses come down? And so a few ringleaders start gathering all the jewelry, all the trinkets, gold jewelry, molds it down and shapes it into a golden calf, which they start worshiping. And they attribute their escape from Egypt and their freedom to this calf. 40 days, literally 40 days ago, God himself came down and said, no idolatry. Well, God sees this, he's furious, okay? And he says, I'm gonna kill those idolatrous bastards. Okay, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but not by much, because he tells Moses, I'm gonna kill all of them, every single Israelite except for you. And then unto you, I'm gonna make a great nation. God was going to make Moses a second Noah, start from a blank slate, okay? And then at this point, Moses pulls out every bag in his rhetorical toolkit. Did you do all that just to kill us here? Did you forget your covenant you made with Abraham? He manages to get God to relent, and he immediately speeds down the mountain, okay, carrying the 2 tablets. Goes down the mountain, he sees the idolatry, and he too is furious. He smashes the 2 tablets. They break, okay, symbolizing law-giving, ethics has failed. He burns down the idol, and then he rallies the Levites, okay, which is one of the few pure groups of Israelites who did not commit the idolatry. And this is what he says to them. This is going to be a lie, by the way. We're not going to talk about that now, but listen close. Exodus 32:27. And Moses said unto them, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. Moses ordered an indiscriminate massacre, okay? And we are told that day 3,000 Israelites died. And it is this act through which Machiavelli elevates Moses as a true political leader, as a true founder. Everything else, parting the Red Sea, miracles, communing with God, that just makes him a prophet. He has religious authority. He communes with God, but that's not enough to be a great leader. To be a great leader, you need to be an armed prophet. You also need to know how to wield violence when necessary. I quote to you Machiavelli. All the armed prophets conquered, and the unarmed ones were ruined. Things must be ordered in such a mode that when the people no longer believe, one can make them believe by force. Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus would not have been able to make their peoples observe their constitutions for long if they had been unarmed. Okay? Why? Why is that? Why do you need arms to establish law? Why did Moses need to call a massacre? Machiavelli's reading is that what motivated the creation of the golden calf were the ringleaders' envy of Moses, that he had this special relationship with God. But envy is this very stable passion. And Machiavelli tells us the only way to kill envy is to kill the envious. If Moses had let the ringleaders live, they would have found new ways to thwart him, to thwart God, which will inevitably cause God to smite all of them. But of course, the Levites didn't just kill the ringleaders. It was an indiscriminate command. This is why, by the way, Machiavelli, in the first quote I read to you, calls it an infinite killing. It wasn't an infinite killing. We're told 3,000 exactly died that day. What he's emphasizing in the infinite part is how it was indiscriminate. So that's the next question. Why didn't he just host a fair trial? Why did he call an indiscriminate massacre? Machiavelli says that cruelty, violence, if used with precision and in a spectacular fashion, is an effective, sometimes the only pedagogical tool that works. Think about how corrupt the Israelites were at this time. God himself shows up in front of you, tells you in his own voice, no idolatry. Less than 40 days go by, you start doing the first thing he tells you not to. After all of that, after everything he did to take you out of Egypt, this is what you do. Such corruption necessitated much more than a fair trial of the guilty. the command was indiscriminate because it wasn't about punishing guilt, but to teach everyone a memorable lesson through a public and uncompromising display of violence. It was precisely because it was so excessive that made it effective. Machiavelli is going to talk about another violent spectacle that we're going to explore later on in the following words. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. And I think he would say the same about Moses' massacre, because it worked. It worked. Moses goes up again, communes with God, comes down with a new set of tablets, and successfully establishes the laws. Okay? I quote to you Machiavelli. In every decision of ours, we should consider where are the fewer inconveniences and take that for the best policy, because nothing entirely clean and entirely without suspicion is ever found. This is the real world that Machiavelli wants to grow us up into, okay? This is why he's considered a realist. He's saying there are two options. You do this massacre or you don't. God is going to kill all of us. And this, in a nutshell, is the type of leader that Machiavelli is trying to cultivate. Someone who doesn't just do the thing that seems right, that gets a little applause from the humanitarians and the moralists and the philosophers, but someone who's willing to do the difficult, but ultimately the necessary thing. In his own words, he wants to teach leaders how to not depart from good when possible, but know how to enter into evil when forced by necessity. Okay, summarize. We've been introduced to this idea of necessary evils, right, by the example of Moses' massacre. And it was necessary because it was the least worst option in a couple of very bad options, right? But I'm still just easing you in, okay? Because it's going to get the story gets a lot more scandalous. And what I'm going to tell you now, Machiavelli himself only hints at it, but a Machiavelli scholar, Maurizio Veroli, pointed out to me, and you can't unsee it after you see it. Moses lied. He lied giving that command. Nowhere does God give that command. Listen to Exodus 32:27. This is the battle cry he rallies the Levites with. And Moses said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel. Put every man his sword by his side, yada, yada, yada. Something's very weird is going on here. Almost every other instance in Exodus, we have the Bible narrate, Thus spake the Lord. The Bible is directly saying, God said this. That's what the Bible does. This is one of the few instances in Exodus where it says, Moses said, God said this. Okay, that's suspicious. What's even more suspicious is that not only did God not give this command, he couldn't have time to give this command. We are told immediately when God relents, Moses speeds down the mountain. That's the sequence of events. And here's the nail in the coffin, okay? Here's why I think the lying reading is right. After the massacre, Moses goes back to God, and God casts a plague upon the people as punishment. This is what the Bible says just a few verses later. The Lord plagued the people because they made the calf. If the Levites were truly God's will, why would God do this kind of double punishment? The Levite massacre was not God's will. It was Moses' will. He lied. One should not reason about Moses, Machiavelli tells us, as he was a mere executor of things that had been ordered for him by God. Okay, this is that hint. Lying about religion, about God, about the greatest and highest things, is something that Machiavelli is going to praise again and again in Roman generals, especially when it comes to augury, okay? Understanding that praise is going to help us understand a lot better why he thinks Moses had to do what he did here. So we're going to take a little detour. So augury is the Roman belief, very popular, that the gods express their will through birds and how birds act. And this was such a widespread and strong belief that when Roman commanders went on campaign, they brought with them chickens, and they brought with him a chicken priest, a priest who manages the chickens. When they want to fight a battle, they give food to the chickens. If the chickens ate, the gods want us to fight. We have the gods on our side. Otherwise, no. This is stupid, okay? It's stupid to us. It's stupid to Machiavelli. It's stupid to the generals. But that doesn't mean you can just violate this at will because your soldiers believe it, okay? And so there's actually two failure modes for Roman generals when working with augury. The first failure mode is quite obvious. You only fight battles when the chickens tell you to fight. You decide, you're the general, not the chickens. But there's an even more subtle failure mode. And Machiavelli tells us the story about a blatantly impious general, okay? He wants to fight the battle. Gives the chickens don't eat. And he says, this is almost word for word, he says, let's see if the chickens want to drink. Throws the chickens in the ocean, the chickens die, and he calls the troop to battle. He loses. Why? The soldiers think, oh my God, we've just offended the gods and I can't be following this impious man into battle. What does the clever general do? The clever general, Machiavelli tells us, wants to fight. The chickens don't eat. He lies. He says, nope, the chickens ate. And then the chicken priest comes running out of the camp, telling all the soldiers, no, the chickens actually didn't eat. You guys are in for big trouble. The general calls the chicken priest a liar. No, he's the liar. And he puts the chicken priest in the most dangerous part of the formation. He gets stabbed by a spear and dies as soon as the battle starts. And he says, look, the gods will. Kill the liar. Okay? The clever general preserves the outward appearance of piety while doing what was politically necessary. And so did Moses. On one hand, Moses wasn't blatantly impious, right? Think about what would happen if he called the massacre in his own name. I want you guys to kill your brothers in my name. That wouldn't have worked. He would have lost all credibility. But Moses also wasn't too precious about his piety that he wasn't willing to lie to do what was necessary, okay? Religion is the strongest force to justify otherwise difficult to establish deeds, and the wise ruler must know how to twist it if necessary. What's the moral of the story? Well, let me ask you this. Did God disown Moses? Jesus in his transfiguration, was he like, oh, I don't want to be associated with this lying guy? No, he's embraced. He's still faultless because he did what was necessary. The ethical foundations of the Judeo-Christian worldview then, the 10 Commandments themselves, is a founding murder hidden by a lie. But I'm still just easing you in because it gets a lot more scandalous when we talk about the actual foundations of Israel itself, okay? So fast forward in the story, the Israelites arrive at the Promised Land. Little problem, there's people in the Promised Land. There's native inhabitants. So Moses, before he dies, and keep in mind that if you recall, Moses does not actually go into the Promised Land. He's kind of like on the boundaries, and it's his successor Joshua that eventually takes him to the Promised Land. Moses tells the Israelites what their policy should be to the native inhabitants. Kill them all. Kill everything that breathes. Leave no one alive. This is not a policy that the Israelites were successful with following through, but that was the policy. And just to give you a sense of the brutality, I'm going to read to you the book of Joshua and one of the conquests of the early cities called Ai. When Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness wherein they chased them, and when they were all fallen on the edge of the sword until they were consumed, that all the Israelites returned unto Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. And so it was, that all that fell that day, both of men and women, were 12,000, even all the men of Ai. For Joshua drew not his hand back, wherewith he stretched out the spear, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. All. That's women and children as well. And this was the policy. So Joshua smote all the country of the hills and of the south and of the vale, and of the springs and all their kings. He left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And Joshua smote them from Kadesh Barnea, even unto Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even unto Gibeon. The Israelites genocided the natives. And this too, Machiavelli argues, is virtuous. This can't be, right? This is just sheer evil. Sure, I get the lying about God thing, but this can't be. On what possible grounds could Machiavelli justify this? Machiavelli in Discourses 2:8 is going to separate and differentiate between two kinds of war. There's war of command and war of habitation. Wars of command is when you don't want to live where they are, you just want them to obey you as a junior partner, as a subject, as a vassal state. That doesn't have to get too bloody. But, quote you Machiavelli, the other kind of war is when an entire people with all its families removes from a place necessitated by either famine or war and goes to seek a new seat and a new province, not to command it like those above, but to possess it. When they are a great number, then they enter with violence into the countries of others, kill the inhabitants, take possession of their goods, make a new kingdom, and change the province's name, as did Moses, who called that part of Syria seized by him Judea. So there's two kinds of wars. Wars of command, wars of habitation. Wars of command are a lot less bloody. Genocide would neither be excusable nor necessary nor good. In fact, Machiavelli praises cities and states that are able to win wars of command in a bloodless way, like when Pistoia willingly subjected herself to Florentine rule because the Florentines were so merciful to them. They acted to them with mercy as a brother, okay? The most virtuous way to relate to your enemy in wars of command is this: crush them with the arts of peace. That's Machiavelli's own words. And I bring this up, again, another detour here, just to show you that Machiavelli has no bloodlust, okay? It's necessity, rather than a perverted fascination with violence, that he advises eliminating native inhabitants in wars of habitation. So that becomes the question. If wars of command can be won in this bloodless way, why does he advise elimination when it comes to wars of habitation? Men should either be caressed or eliminated, because they avenge themselves for slight injuries, but cannot do so for grave ones. So the injury one does to a man should be such that one does not fear revenge for it. In wars of command, you don't need to injure them, okay? You don't need to take their property. You don't even need to disarm them. Maybe an isolated act of violence, of war, of strength is enough. Maybe you don't even need that in the Pistoia example, in which case you should benefit them, okay? You should make sure to turn them into friends, be as humane as possible if you don't need to injure them. But wars of habitation, by definition, will bring injury to the habitants, right? You're taking all of their property, and because of that, you probably need to kill all of their combatants. Now, we moderns, we come in and say, okay, but stop there. Leave the civilians alone, right? Take their property, kill the combatants. Those are the rules of war. Leave the civilians alone. Machiavelli's response would be, okay, let's play this out. Because you've now injured the native inhabitants, but not enough so that you don't fear vengeance from them. You took their property, you killed their combatants, but who are the combatants? Well, they're the fathers, the sons, the grandsons, the uncles, the nephews, the husbands of the civilians that you just let free. What do you think they're going to do? You think they're going to thank you for showing so much mercy? They're going to hate you forever. You don't think the women are going to make it their raison d'etre to burn it into their sons' and grandsons' minds, to destroy you as soon as they have the chance? If you don't think that, that's fantasy. Machiavelli's response to us moderns is this: for wars of habitation, you're already past the point of peaceful coexistence. Can it happen? Sure, extremely rarely, but don't bet your future on it. Machiavelli's point is, if you don't eliminate them now, your people will pay the price in the future when they inevitably seek revenge. Now, to qualify this a little bit, elimination doesn't necessarily always mean kill. The Roman tactic is division, okay? You spread them across your empire so that they can't coordinate with each other. The American strategy is forced assimilation, right? You make sure that they can't speak their own language, they can't practice their own religion. But what elimination means is you take them out of combat. You got to make sure that they can't seek revenge upon you. Now, Machiavelli knows all the bad words you want to call him, and all the bad names: villain, devil, teacher of evil. And he preempts this. These modes are very cruel and enemies to every way of life, not only Christian, but human. And any man whatever should flee them and wish to live in private, rather than as king with so much ruin to men. Nonetheless, he who does not wish to take this first way of the good must enter into this evil one, if he wishes to maintain himself. But men take certain middle ways that are very harmful, for they do not know how to be either altogether wicked or altogether good. Machiavelli does not like the idea of elimination any more than you do. He's not a bloodthirsty, demonic teacher of evil, qua evil. He's telling you, these are the realistic outcomes. Think about it like a decision tree, right? In a war of command, be as humane as possible. Try to crush them with the arts of peace. If you don't have to injure them, benefit them. In wars of habitation, if you want to live on their land, okay, you're already injuring them to such a great degree, just go all the way. What you don't want is you don't want to take a middle way. You try to fight a war of habitation humanely. Either don't take the promised land, keep wandering in the desert. But if you take the promised land, make sure you take all of it. And this dual structure of full humanity and full evil is exactly what Moses prescribes the Israelites in Deuteronomy. Okay, I quote you to Deuteronomy. When thou comest nigh unto a city to fight against it, then proclaim peace unto it, and it shall be. If it make the answer of peace and open unto thee, then it shall be that all the people that is found therein shall be tributaries unto thee, and they shall serve thee. Okay, this is the humane way. Thus shalt thou do unto all the cities which are very far off from these. You're not trying to live there. These are words of command, which are not of the cities of these nations, but of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance. Thou shalt leave alive nothing that breathes, but thou shalt utterly destroy them. This is why Moses is Machiavelli's leader par excellence. He's always thinking about what is the most, this is the key word, possible humane option here. But when he's willing to enter into evil, he goes all the way. And to scare you, to tell you what happens to peoples who take this middle way, he tells us the story of the Samnites. Okay, so the Samnites were one of the rival tribes against the Romans. And due to this sheer act of military brilliance, they trapped the entire Roman army into this valley. So they could have their way with the Romans. They could just decide to kill all the Romans if they wanted to and suffer very little casualty. And suddenly they don't know what to do. Okay, these are historic rivals. A Samnite elder said, there's only two possible options here. Either you benefit them, okay? Let them go, full honors, turn them into your brothers, befriend them. Use this as an opportunity to be friends with them and ally with them. Or you gotta kill them all and take them out of the picture so that Rome does not threaten us. The Samnite leader didn't have the guts to do either of those options. And he took the middle way. He took away Roman arms. It's a temporary kind of disarming of the Romans. It's gonna take them some time to rearm. They made all the Romans walk under a yoke to humiliate them. Or a yoke is what you put ox in to plow the fields. And they made the Romans swear a treaty that they will not attack the Samnites. All cosmetic procedures. The Romans went back, and as soon as they recovered, they utterly destroyed and killed all the Samnites, wiping them off the face of the earth. This, Machiavelli warns you, is what happens to people who go the middle way. Machiavelli's core teaching then is echoed in one of the famous lines from great American philosophers. Quote to you, "There is no such thing as halfway crooks." By the way, another great American philosopher, Tupac, big fan of Machiavelli as well. Read Machiavelli in prison, and his stage name was actually Machiavelli. Anyways, light detour. That's Moses, and that's part one of our lecture. To try to ease you in insofar as one can be eased in to this invitation into evil. Machiavelli, for reasons that hopefully are obvious, has been called a teacher of evil ever since people have started reading him. But I hope you can already start seeing that's not the full picture. So what we're going to do in part 2 is we're going to add 3 important qualifications to this idea that he's a teacher of evil, because I want to make him more digestible and palatable to us moderns. So I'm going to keep delaying and withholding my own objections until the end. Right now, I'm still just trying to make you understand Machiavelli as authentically and as charitably as humanly possible. Okay. The first qualification is that Machiavelli is a teacher of evil, but for the sake of the good. Okay. If Moses didn't massacre, God would have killed them all. If Moses didn't lie, he couldn't have carried out his acts and established the laws. If the Israelites did not pursue a policy of elimination, Israel would always be under existential threat. Every evil kind of is only justified if it is serving some kind of greater good. And even stronger, Machiavelli's conception of the good is not that different from our conception as moderns. He wants a society that is stable, that is protected, that can survive, that has rule of law, that has freedom, and that is really radically egalitarian for his age. And this is what makes Machiavelli worth engaging. Because if Machiavelli is just this power-grabbing self-help guru telling princes how to grab power, or he's out to train tyrants, that wouldn't be interesting. We just disagree with his ends. But it's precisely because our ends, I know it may not seem like it, are Machiavelli's ends, that we must read him as a critique of how we approach politics. He's saying, you think international law, you think your human rights, your civil discourse, your activism, your civil disobedience, if you feel extra naughty, is going to establish you, your peace, your equality, your freedom, your state, your rule of law? Think again. The major difference between us and Machiavelli is not in what ends are good for the state. It's what means are necessary to achieve them. And so moral judgment for Machiavelli does not just stop at evaluating the act in itself. This is good, this is evil, this is humane, this is cruel. In fact, he would probably agree with most of our labels. That's why he still calls it entering into evil. Machiavelli's moral reasoning goes a second step and says, okay, but is this evil, is this cruelty, is it well used or is it poorly used? In other words, in a consequentialist way. He's inquiring about their effects. Those can be called well used if it is permissible to speak well of evil that are done at a stroke, out of necessity to secure oneself, and then are not persisted in, but are turned to as much utility for the subjects as one can. Those cruelties are badly used, which though few in the beginning, rather grow with time than are eliminated. Okay. The most famous example of cruelty well used in all of Machiavelli, infamous really, is Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was an ambitious Renaissance prince, a contemporary of Machiavelli's, who was known for his ruthlessness, his military genius, and his charm. His dad was Pope Alexander, was a pope, and Cesare himself was the closest person who came to unifying Italy at the time. And like Moses, Cesare is held up as one of these beaming exemplars for future leaders to imitate. And also like Moses, it was a seemingly inexcusable act of brutal violence that he elevates as what must be imitated. Okay, so the story is this. Cesare comes to possession of the Romagna, a region in Italy that was terribly managed. Its rulers were weak and incompetent, which led to chaos. It led to all kinds of thieves and crimes rampant in the Romagna. And when a people are so corrupt, think back to the Israelites at Sinai, Machiavelli believes you need a dictatorship who's willing to use force. So he installs a brutal bastard of a man called Ramiro. Ramiro had very little ethical qualms, and he cleaned house very quickly and established order. However, after you uncorrupt a people, you no longer need the dictatorship anymore, right? You want trusted institutions that can sustain themselves. And so Cesare started setting up a much more democratic structure with a civil court and different cities had their own advocate. And at this time, Ramiro became a liability for three reasons. Number one, you don't need a dictatorship anymore. Number two, Ramiro started gaining a princely reputation for himself that could be threatening to Cesare. And number three, because of all the violence that he had to do, people really started hating Ramiro. Okay, what does Cesare do to his effective and quite loyal minister? He kills him. He kills him as a cathartic scapegoating event to purge people's hatred, to show that that's not me, that's all him. And he kills him in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Gets Ramiro, he splits him in half. He lays both halves out in the public square where everyone traffics in the morning. And he lays the knife and the wood block right next to his separate body. Machiavelli concludes this anecdote. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. This, for Machiavelli, is a prime example of cruelty well used. It was necessary to bring the Romagna under order with violence, and then it was necessary to dispose of the dictator. It was contained, okay? It was done in a very, very brief moment with very limited casualties. It secured not only Cesare's position, but it also benefited all the subjects of the Romagna by establishing much more civil, rule of law, democratic institutions. And this is what I'm trying to tell you. Machiavelli wants what we want, right? And his work is a direct challenge to us. You aren't going to vote your way out of the Romagna. This is why, for Machiavelli, seemingly cruel actions, like the Ramiro example, can be long-run, long-term humane. And the reverse is also true. Seemingly humane actions can be actually very cruel. Many times, works that appear merciful, which cannot reasonably be condemned, become cruel and are very dangerous for a republic if they are not corrected in good time. It seems merciful to be kind to criminals, to not punish them too hard. It seems merciful to let them out in early parole, even very violent ones, give them a second chance at life. That's how you end up with the Romagna, right? It's a deeper kind of cruelty. That's what Machiavelli is gesturing at. All right. To summarize, still in part 2 of the lecture, we're still trying to qualify his invitation into evil. The first qualification is, it is an invitation to evil, but for the sake of the good. The second qualification is that moments when you actually need to do this are extraordinary moments. Moments of founding, like Moses, and moments of refounding, cleaning house, like Cesare, okay? In other words, if the first qualification is to say, no, Machiavelli actually shares our conception of the good and of good ends, the second qualification is to say, he also shares with us how to behave in ordinary political life, okay? If you already live in an orderly and lawful state, a free state, in the absence of a crisis, don't do any of this, okay? You don't have to lie, you don't have to call any massacres. Evil would not just be inexcusable, non-necessary, it would be actively just evil, evil qua evil. And even if you actually live in a disorderly state, you're probably not the one to do this. Machiavelli's work must be interpreted as limited to extraordinary times, extraordinary people, in extraordinary places of power. Moses calling the Levite massacre with the authority of God has a different taste than some just random Israelite running up and down to the camp killing people. And I think this qualification is necessary if we are to even begin to make sense of Machiavelli's own life. Machiavelli was born in a very divided Italy where Republican city-states, or some princely city-states as well, are vying for power and even go to war, okay? Machiavelli wrote all of these books, most of his works, in exile, but before his exile, he was a public servant in his native Florence. And so a natural question arises, which is, did Machiavelli, in his political career, because he was an ambassador, right? He was a military leader, he was a public servant and politician, civil servant, did he prosecute politics in a Machiavellian way? No, not even close. In fact, the exact opposite. He was, by all accounts, an extremely loyal, upstanding public servant who gave his soul, dedicated his soul to Florence. In a time that was extremely corrupt, where not taking embezzlement would almost be weirder than taking embezzlement, we have no evidence whatsoever that he took any bribes, which is why he ended up in exile in relative poverty. And even in exile, when he was given a very lucrative salary by Rome, he declined because he was writing the Florentine histories at the time, because he was a patriot, and he wanted to teach future Florentine leaders how to rule through his books. This, I think we can call the Machiavelli paradox, which is most people are right about how good you should be in politics, and then they're complete bastards in their actual political lives. Machiavelli writes about how you should be evil in politics, and then he's the most upstanding and loyal public servant. Why is this? This is why I think we need the second qualification to make sense of Machiavelli's life. Even if Italy at the time required a Cesare to reunify it, and even if Machiavelli was an extraordinary man, he was not in an extraordinary place of power, and therefore you should engage with politics in the ordinary mode, okay? But then another riddle arises, which is, if 99% of the time, 99% of us should engage in the, let's call it nice mode of politics, rule of law, public discourse, why are all of his books about the most extraordinary of cases? And that's where we need to introduce the third qualification, okay? Here's the third qualification. Machiavelli is so interested in the extraordinary, that's the word he uses, actions, because contra the popular perception of being a realist, he's also an idealist. He wants to help princes achieve the most idealistic, grandiose, seemingly impossible tasks imaginable to man. In other words, he is a realist. That's the common perception. The qualification we're adding is that he's also an idealist. And I think this becomes obvious when you compare him to your vanilla, cynical realist, right? Oh, you can't reform healthcare, like we can't get anything done, politics is limited, let's just tend to our own garden. That was the opposite of Machiavelli. Machiavelli believed in the great man theory of history, that rare and marvelous men can rise up in extraordinary times and completely change the course of events. This is why Machiavelli is so obsessed with founding and refounding, okay? Moses and the founding of Israel, Romulus and the founding of Rome, and he was so praising of Cesare, because Cesare at this time, he didn't succeed, but he was the man who came closest to unifying Italy. We can loosely say then that Machiavelli is an idealist in ends, but a realist in means. And it's precisely that tension that makes his work so bloody. It's precisely when you want to really establish a radically different order that you need to break a lot of eggs, okay? And so I hope this last qualification makes you slightly more charitable to all of Machiavelli's bloody evil advice in the following way, which is, he's doing all of it because he's actually quite optimistic about things. Another way to put it is this: even that most idealistic of philosophers, Plato, and Machiavelli criticizes him as such, even Plato would be forced to concede this point that Machiavelli raises. Plato, in his Republic, when he talks about the founding of the Callipolis, the ideal city, he also calls a massacre. All the adults are killed. We're told everyone above the age of 10 are led into the fields. Okay, euphemism if there ever was one. And the reason is because Plato knows if I want to design a radically different order, I gotta start with people who are malleable. I gotta start with the children. So even Plato, I think, is forced to concede this point on the necessity of entering into evil when pursuing grand and noble projects. All right. Summarize part 2. We added 3 qualifications to this intuition of entering into evil that we developed in part 1 through Moses. The first qualification is evil, but for the sake of the good. The second qualification is that these actions are only called for extraordinary times, extraordinary people, extraordinary positions of power. And the third one is that this recommendation comes from the fact that he is an idealist as well as a realist. Hopefully, each of these three qualifications has made Machiavelli a bit more palatable, if not digestible, for us moderns. But what I'm going to do in part 3 is I'm going to push you in the completely opposite direction. I'm going to show you just how radically different of a break Machiavelli is compared to the traditions that came before, namely the classical tradition and the Christian tradition, okay? And it's in that comparison we're going to learn new things about this invitation to evil. The most obvious break between Machiavelli and the tradition that came prior is how he uses the word virtue. If you read Machiavelli right after you read Plato, Aristotle, or even the Christians, you're going to have whiplash every time he uses the word virtue, because it completely has changed its meaning, okay? And these are the paragraphs that are most important to understand what he means by virtue. Fortune shows her power where no virtue has marshaled to resist her. She directs her onslaught to those places where dikes and dams have not been constructed to restrain her. Thus, it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if one wants to hold her down, to beat her and strike her down. And one sees that she lets herself be won, euphemism, more by the impetuous than by those who proceed coldly. And so always like a woman, she is the friend of the young, because they are less cautious, more ferocious, and command her with more audacity. Machiavelli gives us two striking metaphors to think about virtue: flood and rape. One of the defining features of virtue for Machiavelli then is force, okay? An overwhelming, ordering force, which Machiavelli associates with the masculine, that pushes back against a chaotic energy in the world, which he associates with the feminine. When Moses established the 10 Commandments in the wilderness, when Cesare brought the Romagna to peace and order coming from lawlessness, these are all examples of that masculine ordering force taming the chaos of the natural or the political world. The opposite of virtue then in Machiavelli is no longer vice. It becomes effeminacy, okay? The worst thing you can be for Machiavelli is effeminate, lacking in this manly virtue and helplessly pushed around by fortune. But that's the first defining feature, force. But virtue is not just force. The second defining feature of virtue is prudence. Prudence is the classical virtue that survives most intact in Machiavelli. And it's so important because it helps you decide when to use virtues and when to use vices. It helps you to see through the classical teachings, right? Because from antiquity, we're given a series of virtue-vice pairs. Humanity is virtue, cruelty is vice, liberality is virtue, stinginess is vice. But as we saw already with humanity and cruelty, sometimes the humane act is actually more cruel. Sometimes the cruel act is actually more humane. Classical virtues are nowhere near accurate enough to act as a consistent guide for action. What prudence does then is, number one, it tells you what situations you need to use the virtue and what situations you actually want to use the vice. But remember the bold and impious general. You can't just ignore popular morality. Also, what prudence does is it teaches you how to appear to be as virtuous as possible and how to limit the amount of vices that will give you infamy, that will make your life unlivable. Okay. It is not necessary for a prince to have all the virtues, but it is indeed necessary to appear to have them. Nay, I dare say this, that by having them and always observing them, they are harmful. And by appearing to have them, they are useful. Men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because seeing is given to everyone, touching to few. Everyone sees how you appear, few touch what you are. So let a prince win and maintain his state. The means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone, like Moses. For the vulgar are taken in by the appearance and the outcome of a thing. And in the world, there is no one but the vulgar. Think back to Moses and his lie, right? Doesn't matter because he successfully established Israel. Prudence instructs you how and when to violate ethical norms while appearing to be their greatest champions. And even more so than force, this kind of cunning will help you master fortune. You'll never master fortune 100%, but you'll be able to gain control of fortune much more than people think is possible. Virtue, then, in Machiavelli, is an ordering force guided by prudence that helps you overcome fortune. And the best image he gives of this is Chiron. Okay, this is the centaur, half man, half horse teacher of Achilles, Theseus, and a whole host of other classical heroes. To have as teacher a half beast, half man means nothing other than that a prince needs to know how to use both natures, and the one without the other is not lasting. Man represents law. Beast represents force. Law cannot be sustained without force, and force needs law if it doesn't just degenerate into tyranny. Okay, which beast should we use? Since a prince is compelled of necessity to know well how to use the beast, he should pick the fox and the lion. One needs to be a fox to recognize snares, and a lion to frighten the wolves. Okay. Lion is raw power, fox is cunning prudence. That's the image of virtue. You have man, law, order. You have lion, raw force, power. Then you have fox, cunning, prudence. Virtue is an ordering force guided by prudence. And with that image, I think you can already start to appreciate just how far we are from the Christian tradition that came right before him. For Christians, we are half man, half God. For Machiavelli, we are half man, half beast. And it is the bestial part that great leaders need to know how to use. If you're interested in Machiavelli's relationship with Christianity, I filmed 2 interviews that I can share later with some of the best Machiavelli scholars in the world. But I just want to briefly summarize, to conclude part 3, Machiavelli's relationship with the tradition that came before him. So you got the classical tradition, okay? You got classical theorists, Plato, Aristotle, and you got classical heroes like Theseus, Moses, Cyrus. Then you have the Christian era, and then you have the Renaissance, which is the time that Machiavelli wrote in, which gave birth to modernity. Machiavelli hates, strongly dislikes the Christian era because he thinks it's made men weak and effeminate. Like the Renaissance, he wants to go back, he wants to rescue something, okay, from the classical tradition. But unlike the Renaissance, he thinks that the Renaissance has imitated the mere surface, imitated all those useless things like poetry and philosophy and architecture and sculpture. What Machiavelli wants to do is to give you a taste. He used a lot of gustatory metaphors when talking about reading, my 2 great passions, of course. He wants to give you a taste of what classical heroes were like. In other words, he doesn't want to go back to the classical world of theory, Plato, Aristotle. Those people, for him, are just as diluted as the Christians. He wants to go back to the world of classical political action. Theseus, Moses, Cyrus. This is why sometimes Machiavelli frames his project as a complete return, because it is a complete return. Imitate Moses. But also why sometimes he frames his project as a radical innovation, because it is. He's trying to construct a theory of classical political action and not just trying to rescue classical political theory, okay? So do as the ancients do, not as they say. There's a small caveat there where he actually introduces some brand new ideas, even to classical political action like tumults and egalitarianism, but that's the kind of general relation. All right. That's part 3. We talked about Machiavelli's cheap exemplar, Moses, to kind of ease you into this idea of entering into evil. We qualified in part 2 his teachings, his invitation. And in part 3, we put his moral teachings in the proper historical context. And now to end this lecture, I want to offer my critique, okay? Let's say I agree with Machiavelli on everything he has to say about political reality, i.e. what means are necessary for what ends. One should still ask, is it worth it? right? What are the consequences for my character, for my soul, to enter evil into this way? And Plato, in his Gorgias, asks a very similar question. In the Gorgias, a question is posed. Would you want to do injustice or suffer injustice? Okay, so would you want to murder or be murdered? The correct answer for Plato is you want to suffer injustice. Why? Because doing injustice makes you a bad person. It harms your soul directly. But suffering injustice doesn't necessarily, because you're not doing anything. If you react with it virtuously, this is where the Stoics get the idea, if you react to it virtuously, your soul's unharmed. So Plato here in the Gorgias is challenging. It's a very good challenge to Machiavelli. You talk so much about the necessities of human survival, but you haven't given that much thought of what in the human deserves to survive. What's the point if after your massacres, your genocides, you rule a city of ashes with a stone cold heart? What's the point if you have to evaluate your friends, your family in this cold, calculating manner? Isn't that an alienated life worse than death? Isn't there more, Plato would say, to life than just power, glory, survival? Machiavelli's first response, I think, is to say, there is more to life, but not to political life. Machiavelli was a great lover of life. He wrote some of the best Italian comedies in his darkest times in his own life. He loved his friends and playing card games with them. He loved great clothes. He loved wine. He loved great food, beautiful women, that one a bit too much. And Machiavelli clearly was attuned even to the joys of the contemplative life, okay? I'm going to read to you a private letter from Machiavelli describing his day to his friend. When evening comes, I return to my home, and I go into my study, and on the threshold, I take off my everyday clothes, which are covered with mud and mire, and I put on regal and courtly robes, and dressed in a more appropriate manner, I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men. He's starting to read, and am welcomed by them kindly. And there I taste the food, gustatory metaphor, that alone is mine, and for which I was born. And there I am not ashamed to speak to them, to ask them the reasons for their actions, and they in their humanity answer me. And for 4 hours I feel no boredom. I dismiss every affliction. I no longer feel poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. I become completely part of them. This is the most moving account of the contemplative life I've ever read, and it's from Machiavelli. So yes, Machiavelli would say, there is a lot more to life, Plato, than just survival, glory, politicking, but not political life. Political life should just be focused on getting us the basics: stability, order, rule of law, freedom, equality. Because when you try to combine those higher ideals with political life, you're going to destroy both of them. That's how we got classical political theory, when Plato tried to integrate philosophy with the state. And that's how we got the Christian era of effeminate men. Now, on the second issue of, isn't your soul harmed by doing injustice? I think Machiavelli would say, it's not clear that my soul is harmed if I do a necessary evil, right? Because it was necessary. You surely wouldn't say, Plato, that your philosopher kings are like traumatized forever for carrying out the massacre to founding the Callipolis. Why? Because it was the right thing to do. It was the difficult thing to do. And this is a real psychology, by the way. Harry Truman, after dropping 2 nukes on civilians, said multiple times in interviews, he never lost a single night's of sleep over it. Why? Because for him, that was the right calculus. He needed to bring the boys back home. In his mind, he didn't do the wrong thing. And so, Machiavelli would push back against Plato. No, reading my work is exactly how you don't scar your soul. Because my work tells you that the evil you had to do was necessary. That's what I think Machiavelli would want to say as one intuition. But ultimately, I think Machiavelli would concede the difficulty, okay, of doing all these evil acts and not have some stains on your soul, because he writes this: because the reordering of a city for a political way of life presupposes a good man, and becoming prince of a republic by violence presupposes a bad man. One will find that it very rarely happens that someone good wishes to become prince by bad ways, even though his end be good, and that someone wicked, having become prince, wishes to work well, and that it will ever occur to his mind to use well the authority that he has acquired badly. Okay? What he's saying here is a major issue for everything we talked about today. If it's evil for the sake of good, and you just told me, very rarely are good people going to be able to survive going through this. That's a big issue. This is why I think Machiavelli does not write to teach the good man, but the great man. The good man is altruistic. The good man cares about others. The good man is public-spirited for the sake of the public. The great man is self-interested. The great man cares about his own glory, and he wants to help the public because it will help him win immortal glory. And this, I think, is the key insight of Machiavelli, which is altruism, public-spiritedness, compassion. Think Mother Teresa. These drives are not brutal and forceful enough to do all the necessary evil that political founding requires. And they're so fragile that they will dissolve once you enter into evil. Can you imagine your compassion intact after calling a genocide? Machiavelli would say, that's not a reasonable psychology to rely on. But a lust for glory is. A lust for glory is brutal in that way because it's already selfish to its core. This is why, to this day, I've never met a single successful entrepreneur who has as their primary motivation the desire to help the world. I've met infinite failed entrepreneurs with that desire, and if that's your desire, you should just go to the Himalayas and meditate. Because it's not brutal enough to withstand the tumults that you're going to experience. But a concern for reputation, self-interest, avarice, insecurity, or even better, a desire for the glory of helping the world, that can work. That is dependable. Good people always make bad leaders. The reverse is not true. Bad people do not always make good leaders, far from it. But it's those selfish drives that you need to work with, that you need to cultivate as a teacher of princes. And this is why I think Machiavelli spends so much of his work, The Prince and Book 3 of the Discourses, advising the ruler's interests, which is different from the state's interests. One reason is because, as we saw in the case of Ramiro, even the tyrant's interests of securing his own power is actually often greatly aligned for Machiavelli with the state's interests, especially if it's a disorderly state. But even in moments, even in moments when the state and the leader's interests diverge, sometimes he still calls the ruler who elevates his interests above the state's virtuous. Why is that? I think what he's saying is that, look, our best shot at establishing a good and peaceful order in civilization is having a selfish, glory-seeking person at the helm, because those drives are forceful and robust in a way the other drives aren't. Sometimes that just means we're going to have to take the hit. Their interests are going to diverge from ours, but it's still better than trying to build a political order with a good man at the helm. And just how selfish are these great men? They view the enslavement of the people that they eventually rescue as a precondition, as a gift for their own glory. It was necessary then for Moses to find the people of Israel and Egypt enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians, so that they would be disposed to follow him in order to get out of their servitude. Cyrus needed to find the Persians' malcontent. Theseus could not have demonstrated his virtue if he had not found the Athenians dispersed. This gives you a sense, I think, of the hyper-egotistical orientation that Machiavelli attributes to the people he wants to teach. He had no delusions of what motivated someone like Cesare Borgia in wanting to reunify Italy, And he asks us to take a more skeptical view to our other cultural heroes like Moses and Theseus as well. But once you frame it like that, it's glory, that's the kind of currency here. there seems to be a much more expedient path to glory, which is Machiavelli's path. Machiavelli is more glorious than any captain of his day. Plato has more glory now than Theseus. If it's all about glory at the bottom, why don't I just retreat from society? I don't have to deal with any of this, and I just write my books and win glory that way. In other words, studying Machiavelli has thoroughly radicalized me, but just in the opposite direction that he would have hoped for. Machiavelli exposes evil to say, no, you two have this license, go at it. Whereas I read all this and I think, well, yeah, you do need to do all these terrible things, so I'm not going to engage in politics at all. I'm going to try to stay as far away as humanly possible from all of this. I want to be left alone. And on top of that, I still get to pursue more glory. This is the first thing Machiavelli would say to me. It is not enough to say, I do not care for anything. I do not desire either honors or useful things. I wish to live quietly without quarrel, for these excuses are heard and not accepted. Nor can men who have quality choose to abstain, even when they choose it truly and without any ambition, because it is not believed of them. So if they wish to abstain, they are not allowed to by others to abstain. You want to leave. People aren't going to let you. They're going to notice you. You're already in the game. But the deeper thing that Machiavelli would say to me is this. Look, Jonathan, I wrote my books as a last resort in exile. After I tried every single humanly possible way to get back into politics to serve my beloved Florence. Because I loved my fatherland. And I would have gladly given up the opportunity to write these books if I was given in my lifetime another opportunity to serve Florence. This is why, Jonathan, I rank the glory of the founder, the political founder, over the glory of the philosopher. They're the ones who actually do the difficult thing, that help their people in their lifetimes. So your understanding of glory, Jonathan, is limited. If you think it's purely selfish, there's a version of that he calls fame. People like Caesar, according to Machiavelli, have won eternal fame for doing a bad thing, for destroying the republic. That's not what glory is. True glory is the recognition of actually having benefited your republic, your fatherland. And that's what I think Machiavelli would finally say to me, that glory is not just selfish. It has this other-oriented aspect as well. In fact, I think that Machiavelli praises glory so much because it's this dependable psychological mechanism that bridges these two things, that bridges the good and the evil. The great man who desires glory has his own self-interest intimately tied to his fatherland, right? And so glory is as dependable as brute self-interest, but it's often motivated. It often aims at the same publicly spirited ends that compassion is. And so I think Machiavelli has a very strong response to Plato's question, isn't your soul corrupted? I think Machiavelli could say, as he often wrote in his letters, I love my fatherland more than my soul. For the sake of my fatherland, I'm willing to enter into evil, to risk corruption, dishonor, shame. You, Plato, teach withdrawal in bad states for fear of corruption. I enter risking corruption, who's selfish now. That is how much I love my Florence. This was the psychology, by the way, on the other side of the Samnite War, when the Samnites locked the Romans into this valley, and the Romans knew they were toast. If they fought honorably, they would die. But to the proud Roman mind, going under a yoke, disarming, is unthinkable dishonor and shame. So they were lost at what to do. They genuinely considered, okay, just all dying honorably. But then reason prevailed. Since the life of Rome consisted in the life of that army, it was to be saved in every mode, and that the fatherland is well defended in whatever mode one defends it, whether with ignominy or with glory. For if that army saved itself, Rome would have time to cancel ignominy. If it did not save itself, even though it died gloriously, Rome and its freedom were lost. Plato was wrong. A shameful, dishonorable, unjust continuation is better than an honorable destruction because it gives you the opportunity to right the wrong. So when I see Machiavelli and his selfless dedication as a public servant, when I read his labor, all of his books, in educating a future redeemer of Italy, when I witness him bearing through torture, exile, poverty, humiliation, and still trying to serve his Florence, I can't help but see a patriot who is willing to corrupt his soul for his fatherland. And when I realized that, whatever moral smugness, whatever bad words I wanted to call him, fell by the wayside. And instead, I was left with admiration and respect. Because I realized the difference between me and Machiavelli, my moral boundaries and his seeming ruthlessness, was not my aversion towards evil, but his dedication to the good. And the last thought I was left with is, if only I cared about the good as much as that teacher of evil, Niccolò Machiavelli. Thank you. Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to future lectures. If you like this lecture on Machiavelli, go check out my other lectures on Machiavelli or my interviews with some of the greatest Machiavelli scholars in the world. You can find links to those episodes, as well as everything else we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.